right, before we start our next conversation, I just want to remind everyone to keep your questions coming on Twitter to the hashtag Cyber7. We're hoping to wrap those into some of our later conversations. Now joining me on stage, we have Trey Hodgkins, Jay Kaplan, Tom Kellermann, and Tara Maller. So we're hoping this conversation can focus on how we secure the next generation of cyber talent and what the biggest innovations are in the industry. So let's go ahead and get started, guys. Thank you so much for joining us again. I wanted to start out, as we did on the last panel, it's hard to have these conversations without talking about the current budget impasse Washington seems to find itself in. And I'm curious, with the current government shutdown compounded by sequestration, obviously the Pentagon getting disproportionately hit there, how is the budget situation impacting the ability to recruit and retain qualified talent? And Tara, since you're sitting closest to me, I'm going to go ahead and start with you here.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm not really on the recruiting side, but in terms of the government shutdown, I mean, we've seen hundreds of thousands of civilian employees not going to work. We've seen in the intelligence community in the thousands of employees at home. We've also seen, you know, the Department of Homeland Security have a major deficit in terms of being able to recruit people with the technical expertise. So, you know, I find it hard to believe that this wouldn't have an impact, both in terms of shifting people's perceptions and losing the potential talent pool of people who are interested in these jobs, and also making it harder to devote resources to getting the types of people with the expertise. And not just on the technical side. I think a lot of the focus has been on the technical side, but also on the policy side of cyber, which is an area I really think there needs to be more focus on. I'm not a technical cybersecurity person. I've sort of taken other areas and applied it to cyber, like work on sanctions or work on diplomacy. And I think one of the areas we're missing people in the government is more on the cyber diplomacy side, the policy side of the equation, not just on the sort of, you know, back end computer science and technical expertise.
So in a word, it's terrible. If you were a college graduate or someone thinking of graduating, you know, put another way, why would you want to come work for the government? You're disparaged by elected officials about the value you bring to the government. The workforce you are in doesn't have any realistic prospects of salary growth or for that matter, in some areas, career growth. And occasionally the government may shut down and you face the risk of not being paid. So, you know, it's not a very attractive way to get the right talent. You know, probably most of the people who have the skills we're talking about were deemed essential, and they may be working. But, you know, they're still facing the challenges that the other components of the government are not there that they need to continue to be successful. And then, you know, if you're in the industry, this is even a challenge, because even if you're deemed essential on the industry side and your contracts or you're still performing on your contracts, you have the same challenges as your government customer may not be there. Or the elements of your contract where you submit your invoices and get paid, those personnel are not there. So it creates significant challenges around the board for the customer and the contractors.
Going down the line here.
Well, given that 75% of Cyber Command and CIAIOC right now isn't working, we have a serious problem. The people that are watching the walls are no longer there. This is compounded with the reality that we already had a skeleton crew. We were already playing with a quasi-B team because the best hackers in the world don't join the government. They either go private sector or they go underground. What's most worrisome now is the fact that the attacks that have been leveraged, and granted there's a major attack every 5 minutes, they're just burrowing deep inside of us. They're not knocking things down, they're not destroying networks, and that's why we're not talking about them. But the real problem will be when these people come back to work and realize that half of their systems may or may not be compromised.
Certainly a scary forecast. Okay.
I mean, the only thing I can really add is, you know, I spent several years in the National Security Agency, and I see a lot of my friends and fellow colleagues not working at the moment, and I find it pretty unbelievable that they have been susceptible to the furloughs. I think they're back in work starting this week, but they're really playing critical roles defending our nation and in the intelligence space, and it's really an unfortunate thing.
So you said the best hackers in the world either go private or they go underground. And I want to stick with that underground sector. How do you, if you're a company or the government and you're looking to recruit and get the best talent that's out there, how do you reach those people and how do you incentivize for them and make the case that they should work for you instead of stay out on their own?
Well, the U.S. has a culture of bastardizing the hacker community as a whole. Other countries actually treat prolific hackers as almost like athletes. In China, for example, in the provinces, you compete in hacking competitions, and then the government sets you up for life if you're good at what you do. In Russia, you're treated as a national asset, or you're allowed to operate under the blessing of the regime so long as you don't hack anything of national importance. We didn't do that here, and I don't think that culturally is going to change here. But the reality is because we're a society based on capitalism and individualism, if you're technically sophisticated and you know how to become omniscient, why would you want a boss? So, I mean, how do you change that cultural paradigm in and of itself? And if you're actually prolific and you get a great job at the NSA for 6 years, and then all of a sudden one of the major SIs or major Silicon Valley companies is offering you triple your salary with no boss, why wouldn't you join them? So I don't know if there are answers to those questions, rather than I think at the elementary school level, we need to incentivize kids that doing cybersecurity is as cool as being a professional athlete or a singer or something else. But I think it has to, culturally, we have to change that.
And can I just add to that? So we heard the number earlier. I was watching from the back about the 2 million, Chinese monitors for internal domestic surveillance. We have a people labor problem as well, and we're not tapping from all parts of the population because we don't have enough people going into the STEM fields that feed into hacker communities and the technical side. Similarly, on the policy side, we also don't have enough people specializing in cybersecurity. Particularly, if you look at the numbers, security community in general, hovering around 30 to 40% in senior level positions on the women front. In cyber, it's a lot worse because you have less women in these fields. So you're not even tapping from 50% of the population. So you're going to have a numbers problem down the line, especially when you're trying to compete with places like China, which just in terms of the amount of people. So I really think, aside from shifting the sort of paradigm around going from Silicon Valley, to national security jobs, you need to also look at a sort of cultural paradigm shift and making these types of professions appealing to a broader segment of the population, because right now they're just not. So that starts early with very basic things in science and math education, and then later on as well, tapping people from other areas of the intelligence community, the national security community, people that might not have the particular skill set, and that's a problem too. The job postings through the government tend to be very specific in the type of criteria that filters out certain people. But you're not going to be able to fill those jobs unless you sort of broaden the skill sets that might have applicability from other areas of the community. So that's something I'd suggest as well.
Others of you guys want to weigh in on that one?
She's right.
Okay, well, I'm going to challenge you on that. You mentioned the gender gap, kind of. How do you make that smaller, more narrow?
That's the billion-dollar question. I mean, there's lots of issues from education and getting younger girls interested in math and science at an early age. There are startups focused on doing this through toys. I think there's some engineering toy company, Goldie Blocks now, which is targeting girls in engineering games. There's books and media are a huge aspect of this. I know everyone sort of shies away from using like entertainment or celebrity arguments like Homeland to get people interested in security, but it actually has a really big effect. Shows like LA Law, increased law school enrollment, things like that actually do increase people's interest in the intelligence community. As a child, I remember reading books that focused on detectives and work that isn't exactly what I do now, but sparked an early interest. So I think that stuff's important. And then making an extra effort to recruit people from those communities if and when there are openings available.
One thing I wanted to touch on as we're talking about the cultural ramifications here is what it's like to recruit and retain a workforce in kind of the post-Snowden era. And if I could get each of you guys to respond to that, and we'll start down at the end of the line since I started with Tara the last couple times.
So my company, we actually recruit a global community of security experts and incentivize them in the form of bounties to discover vulnerabilities in enterprise applications. The company's called Synac. And so we're looking at this more of a global problem where people who are really good in this space are obviously not just in the United States. And the question really is, how can we leverage people globally for the benefit of the US, whether that's large enterprise or the government? And what we're seeing is a large number of the real talent is in countries like Russia and China and Eastern Europe, and that's what we're ultimately trying to tap into right now. So
I think the mission is off. If this was just an issue of national security, we could create international norms to solve this problem, but we can't. It's a multiplicity of actors. It's a free fire zone. Interpol noted recently, and Trend Micro is Interpol's security partner, full disclosure, that there's a 10% decrease in street crime last year. Is that because more people are going to church? No. It's because criminals are using technology now to leverage criminality. That being said, I think the focus should be on a global effort and a global recruitment supply chain for human capital related to at least thwarting the acts of criminality. If we can get rid of the multiplicity of actors, the gray area, or the swamp, as Melissa Hathaway used to point to, then we can begin the real true nation-state to nation-state engagement as it relates to cyber. So that being said, I have 1,200 threat researchers that work for me. They speak 46 different languages. Yes, there's a vetting process, but the same token being said, I think that our mission sync needs to change towards dealing with the criminality, because the FBI is overwhelmed with caseload. They only prosecute less than 1% of computer intrusions successfully, and it's not their fault. They're just overwhelmed.
So another area that I think we can work on is that our government isn't really engaged in these international conversations, and we feel like they can be a leader, and they haven't done that. You know, there's also the opportunity that's coming up in the transatlantic discussions. We're formulating those. I think that the conversations occurred last week, even though we were shut down. I can't recall. But part of that conversation, for example, is around cross-border data flow. And that one piece of the conversation is an important role that the international conversation needs to occur on, but we can play a leading role, and we're not doing that. So that's another place, another facet where our government can step up. We can have these international engagements that we need to be having and be more effective across the board.
And I agree with most of what was just said. One other caveat I'd add is when we speak of cybersecurity, it seems like it's lumping a lot of different things together, and I think that actually undermines progress in lots of areas. So what is cybersecurity? You can look at it based on the target, you can look at it based on the perpetrator, but it involves, you know, everything ranging from economic espionage from the Chinese going into, you know, computers and stealing information, very different from a potential kinetic attack on a nuclear facility or an energy facility, very different from cyber hackers, very different from attacking, you know, banking websites like we've seen denial of service. So these are all very different things, and I almost say it would be the equivalent of in, you know, the regular realm of violence, grouping everything together from interstate war to terrorism to insurgency to criminal street gang activity. It wouldn't make any sense, but when we talk about cybersecurity, and probably the mix of people in this room tap from all those areas. So I think that actually makes it really confusing, and that's probably one of the things that as we go forward, we need to sort of work on segregating those areas a bit more to work on policy solutions, you know, internationally and domestically on these issues.
I would also like to add to that. When we think of cybersecurity and cybersecurity professionals, you assume they have to be a hardcore coder. Yes, you need hardcore coders. You also need really good system administrators. You also need really good application testers. You need all sorts of different multidisciplinary fields. Analysts, you need people that understand the foreign policy dynamic as well as the cyber context. The same is said for the underground economy. You know, there's been a dramatic evolution of capability both on the defensive security tools and platform side as well as the offensive. So you no longer need to be a true sophisticant to either be a black hat or a white hat in this space. You just need to be appreciative of how these things fit together and what the nuance is, and be a risk manager inherently in what you do. So I think that we could broaden the aperture of who can actually join us in this fight, especially as it relates to the different types of roles that exist out there that aren't just hardcore coder, hardcore geek, you know?
Jay, I'm going to pick on you for a second. So you worked in the NSA, you left and struck out on your own. Kind of talk about your decision making there and whether or not you think that more people will start doing that, or if this trend will kind of slowly decrease. It seems like we've seen a lot of that in the last couple of years.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think you see a lot of innovation happening inside of the federal government. You have really, really talented, smart people there. And the fundamental question is, how do you retain them there? The government's not able to pay the salaries that the large companies can pay in Silicon Valley. The prospects starting your own company are pretty amazing, and the opportunity to leave my job, while it was a really phenomenal position, you know, serving the country, it was just something that I personally felt was a better opportunity for me. So I think it comes down to the government, you know, paying the same salaries as the enterprise workforce, and at the same time incentivizing in other ways to retain the talent once they come on board.
I would also say I think the government needs to pay more respect to its cybersecurity professionals, that they're still being marginalized under the policymakers. They're still being marginalized below the folks that focus on kinetic security. At least bring them up to the same level of importance as the folks who deal with physical security or facility security. And also there's a governance problem throughout the government and throughout the private sector where you have chief information security officers reporting to CIOs. That's like having your defensive coordinators report to your offensive coordinators. The offensive coordinator is going to go for it on 4th and 1 every time. And so they're exacerbating the job and the role of the CISO. And when the CISO says, don't go forward with that mobile-based portal for access to our sensitive data, the CIO is going to always say no. So then you just deal with this chicken or egg phenomenon. So I say just from an empowerment perspective, at a minimum, if he would have been more empowered, and I obviously don't know the nuance, but if you would have been more respected or empowered internally to the organization and treated at the same level as those other folks, maybe for the chance of God, he might have stayed.
Thoughts from you guys on this end?
You know, I just point again at the current situation. It would have to make someone working at NSA who was contemplating leaving, it would have to help make that decision easier. And so, you know, they're both on point with we have to understand the workforce we need, we have to respect them, pay them appropriately and effectively and competitively. But, you know, we have to create an environment in the government. The persistent federal fiscal uncertainty is a challenge to these broader goals that we're talking about this morning. And those issues complicate solutions, and they are part of the problem in finding the solutions that we're talking about.
If you all could name one thing that Washington could do to make it easier to recruit cyber talent, or more generally speaking, what should Washington be doing now that it's not?
Start earlier.
Yeah.
I think they need to start at the high school level. I think there's a lot of great university programs out there. NSA, Centers of Academic Excellence, Information Assurance Scholarship Program, NSF Scholarship for Service Program. But what happens before that, I think the government really needs to start targeting talent a lot earlier in the process.
I think the SANS has done a good job with the Cyber Challenge, but allowing the Cyber Challenge to be the focus for recruitment of professionals at an early stage, and professionals that don't necessarily have to work for the DoD. Why can't they dedicate 6 years of service for a full ride to a civilian agency and do cyber? Why does it have to be the DoD? You know, some kids grow up, maybe not respecting the DoD, but respecting some other civilian government agency. Why can't they dedicate their time there?
There's a couple of things the government can do. I agree that the focus on STEM is critical, and it's woefully inadequate today. Another area I learned yesterday from one of my colleagues that all the folks that are sitting in line waiting to get their H-1B visas for FY14 have a 10-day window to have that process completed, and apparently the clock is at day 8. And because of this administrative challenge, those folks, those talented people who are here to go to work in these kinds of areas, may be lost to us. We may not get them for FY14. At least there'll be a delay. And the other area that I think that we need to focus on is encouraging. I mentioned on STEM. There have been a number of studies about why people don't pursue STEM educations. One of the findings was that parents themselves are one of the discouragers because, we don't have that the pursuit of engineering and mathematics and technology that we had in the days of Apollo and the science and space programs, and we need to try and find a way to light that spark in the people even below high school to younger kids, make them interested. There are things that we can, there are television shows, there are cultural things they can be exposed to, but we have to emphasize that in a way that we're not doing today.
I'll add 2 more to the list. One would be more collaborations with both the think tank and academic community. A good example of this, there's the acronym is ECIR. I think it's Exploration in Cyber International Relations. It's an MIT Political Science Department, Belfer Center at the Kennedy School Collaborative, funded via Minerva. It's one of the few programs I know that really pulls together people from the academic community, the think tank world, and it's funded through government money, and it's focused explicitly on cyber and its focus on the technical side of the equation, but also has lots of people looking at policy issues as well. So that's one thing. And also, I don't have the sort of magic way to fix it, but usajobs.gov, some sort of overhaul to that application process, which probably would take some work. But I mean, just the way that it works in general, I think is actually not conducive to getting people into the system quickly and the right people into the position quickly because of the way it sets up requirements for certain jobs, the questions that it asks. Washington Post yesterday, women won't apply for jobs unless, men will apply for jobs when they think they have 60% of the skills that match, and women won't apply unless they think they have all of them. And on the USA Jobs, it actually asks you to sort of self-assess yourself on if you have certain qualities that match certain jobs. So I think that process alone, just based on the studies of how people self-evaluate, it's just objectively true that there are differences. So we're actually limiting people and filtering it out because of this sort of differentiation between self-assessments.
I want to ask you guys what you think is next for the industry. What innovations are you seeing that you find particularly encouraging over the last couple months, maybe?
For the underground or for the good guys?
Either one.
Well, from the underground, it's all about man-in-the-browser attacks, because if they can compromise the browser, they can compromise whatever network you have sitting on one end or the mobile device on the other. That's if you could secure the mobile device to begin with. The good guy side, I think, not just advances in testing and the assurance capabilities, but things like advanced threat detection protection that correlates an event that happened in your network to the outside world. You can't rely on the US government to provide you with the adequate intelligence that you need to understand what you should be expecting next. So how can you make those predictions? How can you be more predictive?
Jay?
Wow, there's a lot of solutions coming out to market right now. I think people is always a fundamental challenge. Making sure that they don't open up spear phishing emails, very, very targeted attacks. When you look at advanced persistent threat, I mean, it generally starts with some sort of spam, piece of spam. There's a lot of technology coming out today that I think helps automate the protection of those types of threats, and I think that's something that enterprise and government should really be looking at right now.
I think, again, looking at the government, the experience there is that they're so far behind the rest of the world, the commercial world, I should say, and even things that you and I would do on a normal basis, perhaps on our personal computers. I think some areas, there are pockets in the government that they're not even doing those things. So enhancing the roles of the CISOs is one way to do it, and being better coordinated in things like acquisitions, and being more uniform in activities so that you can adequately manage at an enterprise level rather than the way the government buys today, which is very siloed.
Stick with you for a second. On the acquisitions process, do you think it's working as well as it should, and if not, what needs to be changed?
The people that I work with, my leadership, have concluded that what we have today can't be fixed. It's reached the point now where it is so disparate and so piecemeal that we need to do a wholesale evaluation of the process and re-examine in the way that we did in the mid-90s. And that was a period of time when the government realized it can no longer build the custom hammer. You all probably have heard those stories. And it opened itself up to commercial items and concluded that, hey, the government doesn't have to spend all the R&D dollars. There's a lot of that going on in the commercial space. If somebody's making a hammer commercially, let's go buy that one rather than reinvent one ourselves. And we saw a transformation in what the government buys and how it uses it at that time. And we need to go back to some of those tenets, and we also need to look at the actual process. It's extremely cumbersome. It's challenged in a workforce way that many of the other issues that we've talked about this morning are challenged. The people who have the skills are retiring, and things like the current situation help make those decisions for them. The people that are there, they do a great job, but many of them don't have many years of experience. And when you're talking about buying multi-billion-dollar activities or transacting in that way for the government, it takes some experience, it takes some knowledge, and a lot of that is leaving. So a wholesale review of the process is where we are.
Tara, can you speak a little bit about the innovations and specifically the policy side, maybe not necessarily the technical aspects?
Sure. I guess I was going to try to wrap up with a few positive comments rather than things that the government could be doing better. But on the positive side, I mean, I agree that we could do a better job making cybersecurity professionals, raised to the caliber or perceived to be at the caliber of other areas. But on the positive side of the equation, I mean, cybersecurity was sort of listed as the #1 issue by James Clapper in his testimony in March, sort of raising it. Unfortunately, bad news also raised the profile of cybersecurity with the release of the Mandiant report and the summit that President Obama had out in California. So these are positive things in terms of, I guess, increasing, you can call it media coverage, but even if the media coverage is on the attack side, I think it's just increasing awareness of the cybersecurity arena and realm. So that's one thing. The other encouraging thing I would say is that despite all of the reports, the Mandiant reports and the serious nature of everything going on, in terms of interstate hacking, coming out of China, I was in China last month in August for a conference on foreign policy cooperation, part of it being on cyber. And at least and I know this is just in a informal academic think tank sponsored setting, but it was a pretty cordial diplomatic tone to the conference and a pretty frank exchange of ideas, both in terms of presenting policy papers. I presented one on cyber diplomacy and ways we can, work together on certain issues like the hotline that was just established with Russia and just simple tools and the working group and things like that. So again, as with everything in international relations, from Iran to Syria to cyber, rhetoric is only good once you trust and verify and go forward, but it's always positive to have the rhetoric developing first. And we have seen that in terms of some of the strategic dialogues and exchanges that have been set up, but obviously more needs to be done.
Can you guys talk a little bit about the partnerships between Washington and Silicon Valley? Jay, I think this is kind of a natural question for you, and how that partnership's working and what kind of relationship building is going on there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's an easy avenue to get a Silicon Valley company in front of the right people in Washington. I mean, there's so many different agencies and people at a high level who look at new companies and how the government can make use of them. And I think it's certainly challenging. Having connections into the government certainly helps, but for new companies who don't have those connections, there's not like a centralized place. You have a new product, you have a new service that can really help the government, and you go there. And I think that could be something that could be quite interesting if that could be established.
I think other people address the topic of kind of the public-private partnerships.
So I have 1,200 researchers that see things, and I want to share this information with the government, but because of the lack of proactive behavior on the Hill vis-a-vis passing some information sharing bill, I can only share limited data. It's not about marketing. It's not about metadata. It's really just about who are the organizations or individuals attacking who, and really what is occurring during those attacks. It's impossible without the information sharing bill. Now, everyone knows the whole rub on that is because it's about ownership and authorship, about which side gets to take claim for that. I highly recommend that we get off our hands and pass that, because I have literally 7.2 terabytes of threat data every day that I could share, but I'm unable to do so because of legal realities.
So I was going to say that the partnerships are critical because at least in the ICT sector, so much of the infrastructure is owned privately, and the government's going to have to work with those companies to understand the kinds of things they're seeing on their networks and have the ability to create the legal frameworks that people need to share that information so we can coordinate. There is also a piece of legislation that was introduced right before the shutdown started that looks to incubate new advancements in technology and other areas in this sort of a startup nature and bring those things forward to the commercial world. So there are some positive movements that would try and incubate those things, looking at partnered R&D between universities and the government, things like that, and then bring the capabilities that those research labs perhaps were producing and commercializing those. And that it's structured in a way for small startups to be able to capture those technologies and bring them to market.
How easy is it to break into the market if you are a small startup and you're going up against these other new emerging startups? You have obviously the big behemoth that is Washington hanging over you as well.
It's not easy, and especially given the sheer number of startups out there today. it's hard to get out. It's hard to get out there and get your name known. You know, I think having the connections help, having the right investors help. But if you're just a little guy with an amazing solution, it's really difficult to get your name in front of everything else that's out there. It's a very crowded space right now.
I want to turn back to the question of talent again, because that seems to be at the root of all of these discussions. What would you say that we're doing right in terms of recruiting and retaining talent? We've kind of talked about everything that we're doing wrong and that we're not doing and the people we're not reaching.
You know, look, we have an amazing mission. You know, the NSA has an amazing mission. CIA has an amazing mission. All the other federal agencies who are protecting our critical infrastructure have really, really exciting opportunities. And I think just highlighting those to the people who currently work for them will cause the network effect. I mean, you know, I think nothing's more powerful than internal referrals, and if you have really top caliber talent sitting within your federal agencies, you need to leverage those guys to bring more people in, and you need to make them happy and listen to what they're saying to ensure that you can retain them. So.
Well, here's an example within Secret Service. Secret Service has a lot of great investigators. So you have a really talented cyber investigator for Secret Service that's all of a sudden being told, oh yeah, you got to go on protective detail now for a year. Well, you're going to take this one person, and you don't have that many of them, off of what they're focused on to do their traditional mission. Well, why not change some missions? I mean, basically at FBI and Secret Service, there's a lot of very talented people who get distracted or forcibly distracted through their traditional roles, but they've obviously demonstrated capabilities that go beyond the role that they were originally hired for. So I think opening up the flexibility in certain agencies will be important.
Something that we've supported for some time now and certainly could be made more robust is the ability for government personnel to come and work in industry as, you know, call it an internship, call it what you fellowship, and for industry folks to go into government and to share ideas and to share experiences and to begin to understand the challenges that both of them face. You know, for example, we find that a lot of people who work in government don't understand the business drivers out there and why companies behave the way they do. And so just exposure to those kinds of simple basics helps better understand what is motivating both sides and helps people understand what each mission activities are and how each can help each other succeed. So better visibility, better, you know, open up that aperture. Programs today that exist and that are authorized, unfortunately, we're talking about perhaps dozens of people that have taken advantage of that, and we need something that we can scale up so that the best from Silicon Valley, for example, can be sent and spend 6 months working in these agencies where they have incredible missions and they have great challenges that people would love to tackle, but because of the hurdles we've created, we can't do that effectively.
Yeah, just to echo that sentiment, I mean, we live in a world that's quite interdisciplinary, interconnected, and interdependent. And when you look at job postings for jobs, they're quite siloed, and we don't actually try to hire based on knowledge across these places. We tend to have job listings that are very focused. And I mean, I haven't done recruiting for cybersecurity jobs, but I did work at a startup for a while and hire students right out of college. And one of the things that I think startups do really well, and I mean, you might be able to speak to this out in California, I was in New York, is they tend to hire for talent, not necessarily particular job descriptions. In fact, in many times, they don't even necessarily have a job description. They just sort of send you to a career fair, and you're supposed to, you know, find smart and interested people in the mission of your startup, and you figure they're going to be able to learn, pending that they have, you know, assuming they have some applicable skill set. That smart people, obviously this is not true on, you know, technical computer science knowledge where you'd obviously need the specifics, but in lots of roles on the cyber side and the policy community, you can tap people from other backgrounds that you might not think of as being traditionally cyber centric. So that would be one way. And the other, I mean, I think that's a great idea in terms of some sort of, you know, rotational program across different places as well.
You know, we would go so far as to say it's a requirement in the career path, for particularly you can establish it that way for someone in the government. You know, and certainly look at having it as a requirement in the career path for someone on the business side, industry side.
And just as one other point on that, it's a personal anecdote. So right after 9/11, I was in college and I was an American politics focused government major with no interest in security, but thought it might be a good idea. after 9/11 to take some courses on it. So I returned to college. It was probably October 2001, and I decided to do an internship at the Dartmouth Institute for Security and Technology Studies with no background in anything related. And the first project he handed to me was doing research on cyber terrorism and cybercrime, and I had no idea what that was. But maybe if that had never happened, I might not even be here on this panel today. So if he had said, oh, but you don't have a technical background, or you are an American politics major. So just things like that, and that's just a personal anecdote. I mean, very small things can open up very big windows or doors or whatever the right expression would be.
I think Tara brings up a good point, though. I mean, I don't think anyone in college has the background, I am a cyber guy, I know cyber, you know. You don't get that experience unless you're working in the space. So I think there needs to be a focus on just looking for the really smart computer scientists, the people who are highly technical and are interested in the security space, and then teaching them, you know, the skills that they need. And I think the government's doing a pretty good job at that. They're recruiting the right talent, they're bringing them in, and then they're putting them through the right coursework to bring them up to the skill level that they need them to be at to accomplish the mission.
All right, guys, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. I'm going to have you go off this way, and we'll move into our next topic. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.